Hello everyone and welcome back. As part of our 3.2 GHz challenge, today we are going to look at the benchmarks for the stock settings for AMD's Athlon64 3200 Plus for socket AM2. Launched 3 years after the original Athlon XP 3200 Plus, this CPU is the most recently introduced we're reaching for in this series. We will start with the BIOS. This is the standard AMI type, the one that Asus uses as well. Besides the system information, the main tab doesn't contain anything useful, and we switch to the Advanced tab. Within the CPU configuration option, we're going to try to set up the RAM to be as close to the DDR1 modules we had in this series, and I'm very happy that I can pick a 200 MHz value, making it equal to the modules we used on the 754 or 939 Athlon64. Also, I tried to get the latencies as close to the original modules as the motherboard allows. Next, there are the chipset settings, where we disable the features we don't need and set up the aperture size to something bigger than the RAM available on the video card. I've seen issues that require more than the installed RAM and also issues that require less than the installed RAM on the video card. Just from my observation, it is better not to have the aperture size the same size as the installed RAM on the video card. The rest of the pages are pretty standard. Now let's look at the CD contents. Now let's go to Windows and see more details about the configuration. This CPU was available starting with May 2006, and we have 3 years of CPU evolution, and this is the third AMD socket we are looking at. Just like the previous Athlon64s, this CPU doesn't run at 3.2 GHz. The number is just so we can compare it to other processors. Still, by 2006, Intel has moved to a more efficient architecture that achieves better results with a lower frequency and no longer uses a one-to-one match for the frequency to the performance rating. Fortunately for us, the Athlon64 still uses this number, and it directly competes with the CPUs we had so far in this series. Besides the SSE-free instructions we had for other Athlon64s, we can see that AMD has added a new one, the AMD-V, helpful for virtualization. Its technology is still on 90 nanometers, stuck there since 2004, but it may be an evolution like we have seen Intel do with their 14 nanometer. AMD looks more confident with this CPU as they have reduced the level 2 cache to just 512 kilobytes. Also, the hypertransport known as HT-Link, although 1000 MHz for this CPU, is set to just 800 MHz, since the M-Force 3 on this motherboard is showing its age. but the tests I've seen for this feature show a less than minor or no difference using slower speeds. Let's go to the memory tab and see the latencies. This CPU only has support for DDR2, that's why we were forced to use DDR2 memories, but we managed to get it running at 200 MHz, just like DDR1, and we also managed to get the latencies as low as the motherboard can go. The OCZ modules were really flexible in that aspect. Now let's look at the tests. And we start with SuperPi that produces a less than impressive time on par with the original Athlon XP. And we continue with PCMark 2002. Next we look at Sandra 2004, where the CPU looks like a match for the original Athlon XP. I held my breath for these first few tests because I thought that benchmarking 3 years advancement in CPUs may yield far better results. Looks like this impression was unfounded, and we were right to test the CPU in the 3.2 GHz series. There is one thing though that really shows progress, that's the memory department. We can remember that starting with socket 939, AMD introduced a dual-channel memory controller inside the CPU that made a big difference. Well, this CPU is now working with DDR2, so there's another leap. And back then, using DDR2 really showed improvement over DDR1, and the memory graph shows how big it was. At the beginning of the tests, I was concerned that there would be a big CPU difference, but I'm relieved it is only in the memory section. Let's continue with the rest of the tests. We now have Cinebench 2003, and this is CPU Bench 2003. Finally, we look at Memcache to see the DDR2 in action. Then we look at the encoding speed, and we close this batch with ViewSpec Performance 7.1. Next we move to the graphics benchmarks. As usual, we start with 3DMark 2001 running on the 66.93 driver we usually use. Next we have Aquamark 3 and Aquanox benchmarks. Code Creatures is next, and we follow it with X2 the Fret. The last two graphics tests that we are going to look at in detail are Comanche 4 and Unreal Tournament 2003. The next few tests are quite repetitive and I'm only going to show the results in order to save time, but they will be included in the chart comparison so we can see how this system compares to the others. And we start with Quake-free arena demos without the GL extensions. And follow it with the tests with GL extensions enabled. We continue with two other OpenGL Quake-free engine games, Return to Castle Wolfenstein and Jedi Outcast. Serious Sam the Second Encounter and Far Cry are next, both with 3D and OpenGL renderers. Next, there are some more OpenGL tests. And finally we have Fable, Realstorm and NVIDIA's Chameleon benchmarks. Next we are going to look at several games. We will start with Counter-Strike 1.6, launched in September 2003, that falls straight into our 2003 time frame. We are running the game in 1024 by 768 with an OpenGL renderer.
Two enemies left. Inside. One guy left.
The next game we are going to look at is Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and we will try a level with long distances and fog just to test the low frame rates. As we can see, the average is 91, which is very good, although I feel there's a frame limiter somewhere. And the 1% low is around 70, and the 0.1% low is around 40, so the system is more than capable of running this game. The next game we are going to look at is GTA Vice City, and we will start with the settings. While driving I didn't notice the small loading, so the 0.1% lows went to 6 frames per second, but they were a constant 30 before that. We can see an average of about 100 frames per second, and the 1% low is almost 50 frames per second despite the loading hiccup. So like the previous game, GTA also feels very good on this setup. The last game we are going to look at today is Halo. Launched in 2003 for PC, we are going to run it in 1024 by 768 with the details set to high. As we can see, the GeForce 4400 Ti shows its age, and also because it only supports DirectX 8.1, we get an average of almost 30 frames per second, with the 1% lows failing by half the average. For this game I would recommend either reducing the graphical settings or upgrading to a DirectX 9 video card to make it fully playable. I started the benchmarks for the AM2 Athlon64 4200 Plus with a little concern that too much time has passed since the launch of the equivalent Athlon XP, and we would be faced with a very different and powerful CPU. Having a superficial look at the results, AMD was more than true to its performance rating, and besides the added instructions, it looks like there's no performance gain over the Athlon64s. To be more accurate, it looks like some performance was lost due to the reduced level 2 cache, oddly making this CPU closer to the Athlon XP than the other Athlons. But the games ran fine and they were enjoyable as ever. In the next episode, we are going to look at the overclocking potential and the charts for the benchmark results. Thank you and see you next time.